My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Dr. Carolyn Biltoft. Carolyn received her PhD in world history from Princeton University in 2010. Her work fuses the tools of world history, intellectual history, cultural studies, and critical theory. She is interested broadly in the dynamic interactions between globalizing structures and infrastructures and diverse beliefs, emotions, concepts, and human life worlds. Her first book, A Violent Peace, Media, Truth, and Power at the League of Nations, presents the League as a performative global stage for the production and contestation of a wide range of truth claims in an era of increasingly violent, totalitarian political projects. My conversation with Carolyn today revolves around the nature of truth and our incomplete understanding of it. Because each individual can only experience firsthand a small aspect of reality, we have to place our trust in others to report accurately if we're going to expand our understanding. If we misplace that trust, then our model of reality won't actually be accurate. We tease out many of the implications of this insight, as well as some of the similarities and differences between the scientific and the religious mindset, and some of the implications for our educational system, and much, much more. It is with great pleasure that I bring you my conversation with Carolyn Biltoft. A note to our video users on YouTube. At Carolyn's request, the episode was recorded in audio only. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Carolyn Biltoft, thank you for talking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you for having me.
I want to talk to you about your area of expertise because it's been a passion of mine, and that's really the search for truth and the nature of facts and how we can ascertain them, and people's credulity in believing, sometimes quite fervently, in things that are patently untrue or false. And so there's a number of dimensions to this, and I want to explore as many of them as we can today. But to start with, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you and what motivated your search, not just for truth itself, but in how in studying how people search for truth and how many people can often be waylaid in that search.
Well, for me, it's a pretty straightforward existential journey in that I grew up something of a kind of inherent, irremediable. I was a skeptic in a religious family.
Mm-hmm.
And so
this is something that many of our listeners will be able to relate to.
Yes. So, and I actually couldn't believe in the way that my family did, like no matter how many times I tried, and I did fervently try. So, the quest for me was something about trying to turn the question of how people believe or come to believe or continue to believe into something of a mode of understanding for me in an intellectual way. So it really sits at the center of my intellectual journey, this question of the nature of belief.
So what was it about most people when they grow up in a particularly religious family, their children, they trust and they love their parents, and they adopt the philosophy, worldview, and religious stance that their parents have. What was it about the belief, about you, about your parents, that made you a skeptic from what it sounds like a very young age? Most of the people that I've spoken with only came to skepticism and that radical doubt much later in life.
Mhm. I mean, I think like the strange and unique thing about my particular journey was that my parents themselves, they were religious, but they also provided a lot of secular intellectual tools. Partly as the idea that faith fervently and ardently believed should be questioned. And so, I mean, I was homeschooled from age 10 to later in life to age 16. And so I read a lot of religious texts and doctrines, but also a lot of philosophy and ethics. But I think for me, part of that effort with them was that I really can't answer that question because I just was always questioning from the time that I kind of emerged from,
Hmm.
emerged as a verbal linguistic little creature. I was always asking questions and, dissatisfied with certain kinds of answers. And then also there's a strange thing about the ecumenicalism of Christianity, um, which exposes you to the nature and diversity of the world. Um, and yet, for me, it didn't really make any sense that one single faith could be made to cover all the different ways of being and living and experiences that people had. So, to me, just naturally, in the course of being exposed to the study of comparative religion from my dad, the theologian, I started to think it was very improbable that there could be a single religious truth, um, that there could ever be a single religious truth to kind of meet the radical diversity of the human race. So that was from a very young age. I could never shake the feeling of the improbability of that.
Okay. And that kind of led to your academic career studying
Hmm.
what people believe, how they believe it, how people arrive at their conclusions, and then I guess also measuring in some way how accurate people's beliefs reflect the world, the facts, or the universe that we inhabit.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, a big part of it is compassion because I think it's not, there's a lot of secular minds that are very dismissive of religion.
Hmm.
But I know very sophisticated, loving, it's not just like it's the drug of rubes religion, right? Like I know very smart, sophisticated, wonderful people that believe very fervently things that I consider mystically, like magic, right? Improbable, like improbable beliefs, the transubstantiation of the bread and the blood turning into, the bread and the wine turning into the body and bread of Christ. Like all these kinds of
Right.
doctrinal forms of magic that for a rational mind seem absolutely impossible. That people that are very smart and very wise and have law degrees and medical degrees, that they could hold these things to be true. For me, I needed to understand why. So partly that I could maintain a kind of compassionate, open-minded, open-hearted dialogue, with people that I felt believed things that were just so radically improbable to the turn of my own mind.
So let's explore that a little bit more because there are many people much smarter than I am, and I don't know you well enough, but I'm going to make a bold assumption and say there are many people that are much smarter than you as well,
Definitely.
and uh, who do hold beliefs that we consider so improbable they can be dismissed, not in the sense of dismissing the people that hold them, but that
Hmm.
these ideas accurately reflect reality are just too improbable to seriously hold.
Hmm.
One of the greatest minds in human history, I'm thinking of Isaac Newton, who came up with calculus just by thinking upon it. His Principia Mathematica was essentially invented the modern understanding of the discipline of physics. But yet and he's rightly known and celebrated for his contributions to human knowledge in that sense. But his writings on Christianity and on the Trinity far outnumber his writings in mathematical and
Yes.
scientific disciplines. But what he actually wrote is not common knowledge. But there's no question that he was a great mind, who had insights into physical reality that, as far as we know, nobody had to that point.
Yeah.
So how is it that in these doctors and lawyers and academics and brilliant people that who are tremendous and tremendously ferociously intelligent and curious people can also hold these beliefs that run contrary to so much of what we understand about the universe that we live in? How do those reside in the same person, in the same mind?
Well, I think all of us harbor, um, I think all of us harbor something that I would like to call the domain of holiness, which is that
Okay.
we put theory where in the place where there's an unknown. And so I think even the most secular atheistic minds do precisely that. There are,
Okay, so explain that to me. Let delve into that a bit
so
more, please.
so we don't know. We get on, we knock on wood. We have superstitions that we engage in, or we, like some people, think about quantum mechanics as a quasi spiritual placeholder. I think it's just that, the human condition is that we have to navigate the unknown. And for some people, like mathematics and scriptural doctrine can sit side by side, because to some extent it deals with those abstractions, with those things that are bigger than experience, the unknowns of the universe that we'll never be able to answer definitively, or at least not with our current state of knowing. And so to me, like, I came to understand that what's always at stake somehow is how much stable how much stability do people need to function? Intellectual stability. Do people need to function? To what nature and degree? Some people have a high need for kind of very stable systems to help them navigate the kind of daily unknowns, right? And some people are more comfortable with the unknowing. And I think thinking about belief and truth on the spectrum, maybe there is an absolute truth. The extent to which we can all grasp it, let alone agree on it, is very limited. But what we can look is the process by which people reach for forms of knowledge or forms of belief to function in their daily lives. So that's what starts fascinating me as a historical object. Like, what makes people believe one thing and not another thing? How do they relate to evidence? Right?
Mhm.
What kind of violence are they willing to engage in order to feel sure? Right? That's another big question for me. Like,
Yeah. Okay. I definitely I've got a few more questions, but I definitely want to come back to that
okay,
one.
great. We'll do that.
So, but when you started, it sounded a little bit like you were talking about the God of the gaps, which is
Yes.
there are things that we don't understand, broadly
Hmm.
speaking, just like as a species, and
Hmm.
that's where we say, okay, God acts in this area that. Where we don't understand what's going on. So God made it rain, God made it flood, God made the sunshine. Now we understand about weather systems, about natural disasters. We no
Hmm.
longer attribute it to the deity.
Yeah.
But then you were talking about things like quantum physics, which we as a species have a pretty good understanding of, at least in
Hmm.
terms of its effects in the universe. But the vast majority of humans know the term quantum physics, but don't actually understand it. It'd be really if you go back 100 years, there was an expression that said, if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't understand quantum
Yeah.
physics.
Yeah. Hmm.
Uh, and most people today don't, right? You need a graduate level course
Exactly.
in physics before you
I
can,
don't, for example.
right. So, so is there a bit where I want to make sure I'm understanding you properly, is that there's so much to know. Any one person has an incomplete understanding of even what we as a species have
Hmm.
knowledge of. And there's so much that we don't know as a species. But as an individual, we want to have a consistent worldview and also a comprehensive one. Like I want to be able to feel that I understand the universe I live in, so that I can navigate it on a
Hmm.
daily basis. And because there are going to be gaps, like no matter how much you study, if you
Yeah.
study physics, well, that'd be good for you, but your knowledge of biology is going to be incomplete. If you study
Yeah.
biology, that's great. You're not going to understand sociology or psychology or neurology or history, right? You'll have at best a surface level understanding of all of these areas. So we um, we extrapolate from our current set of knowledge, and sometimes those extrapolations are inaccurate, or we just make up things that don't conflict with what we already know, and
Mm-hmm.
so we miss the nuances and subtleties and the uh, the counterintuitive aspects of in some other area of the human experience that we haven't directly investigated, or that we haven't uncovered from first principles. Is that a fair? I
Yeah.
was going to say summary, but then I realized I've spoken for about as long as you did on that.
No, I mean, I think that's fair. I think so. Yes, the God of the Gaps. Actually, my niece right now is studying medieval history, and maybe it's a family trait. She's obsessed with this kind of theory in the medieval as a way of thinking about the medieval period. But I think my additional point of view of that is that, just as you said, because even modern knowledge is divided into expertise, and therefore, through the nature of the division of knowledge into branches and disciplines, for ordinary people, even other experts, every fact we believe requires a leap of faith because we didn't arrive at that knowledge through a firsthand experiential expert relation. So we trust the quantum physicists to know what is string theory. Like those of us who believe, like let's say we trust the experts.
Right.
We trust the quantum physicists to think about the nature of space-time and other phenomena, because we cannot ever sort of verify those truths for ourselves. But that in itself is a leap of faith. And so my hope is to help people see that scientific knowledge is not different than religious faith, to the extent that most ordinary people have to, it's mediated through texts, through prophets, through like just like religion is, right? And so it's a different way of looking
Right. So
at
it's really a matter of, since I, Leslie Rosenblatt, am just a guy. I have no particular connections. A reasonably well functioning brain, but certainly no particular genius or brilliance. I have to trust
Mhm,
somebody
mhm,
if I'm going to understand pretty much anything about the world beyond my own very limited experience. And so then the challenge becomes, where do I place my trust? Do
mhm,
I put it in? Do I place my trust in the media reports of a
mhm,
scientific finding? Do I place my trust in actually going to the scientific papers that were published? Do I go with like my friends and family? Do I place my trust in uh, a religious figure who, with great charisma and gravitas, make bold claims about the nature of the universe? And I look around in my community and I see everybody nodding, and so do I. And so then a search for truth in many ways can be reduced to, or is equivalent to, a decision on which authorities or which voices to place my trust and belief in, or, to use your word, to put my faith in.
mhm. Yeah, exactly that. And so this dilemma, the point of saying that isn't to reduce science to mysticism. It's to acknowledge what we face, especially in democratic, information-driven societies. It's to acknowledge what we face in trying to stabilize our control forms of public health measures, or right, the policy implications that grow from belief. I think we have to really take seriously and understand the nature of trust in that process, and how that nature of trust isn't just connected to our intelligence. It's connected to where we stand in the world and where we get our sense of significance and belonging, right? So
Okay, so
some
that's interesting. So so tell me more. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think like one of the things that I noticed is, a lot of people, the reason why they absorb received wisdom is because their communities believe certain things. And those communities become a requirement for, feeling secure, understood, accepted, like those kind of basic primordial needs we have as humans to belong. And sometimes people don't need just belonging. They also need that kind of narcissistic reassurance that they're worthy, that they're valuable, that they're that they're
Right.
significant,
Oh,
you know?
we call it you can call it narcissistic, but it can be peer pressure or just
Yeah,
wanting to have a community of friends. And so, what am I
exactly.
going to do? My behave if I want to be in good standing with my community, and really there's rather few people who don't.
Mm-hmm,
You choose your community, but then you want to behave in a way that you will be whoever you consider your peers,
mm-hmm,
and that may be a personal choice once you reach adulthood, but you certainly want to be held in reasonably high esteem by your peers, so your behaviors will be shaped in some way
mm-hmm.
by
Yeah,
what your peers, by the people that you hold in high esteem. Your behaviors will be shaped by them because you want to be held in high esteem
exactly.
by those people. Okay.
Exactly. And I think the virulence of those sentiments, like the ability to listen to people that believe differently than you, is really determined by how existentially secure you feel, right? If your financial access is limited, if you feel like your status
Mm-hmm.
is threatened, if you feel, strange or exiled or misplaced. Like there are all kinds of things I think that, and there's a lot of good psychological work on, the kind of existential safety requirements to open-minded listening, or to be able to have a kind of multicultural or multi confessional conversation that doesn't get heated.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so much, our beliefs are so much tied to the life we have now compared to the life we aspire towards, right? And so, kind of like where we are secure and then where we hope to be able to go, and what we consider the obstacles or the promise, right, of where we stand and where we hope to be. Um, and so, then this whole world of knowledge at our fingertips right now, that's so instantaneous and everywhere, it really changes the dynamics by which we anchor ourselves in a certain epistemic community, social, political, kind of socioeconomic, ethnic, right, community, and where we hope to go. And I think like this virulence of not being able to listen to subtle or nuanced opinions in moments of extreme feeling of threat, of existential threat that people might feel real. It can be a real, it can be literal violence, literal starvation, literal, right? Or it can be just perceived like a loss of face or a loss of status, or,
Okay.
so that's kind of how I think of the geography of
All
that.
right. So now this is like the second time you've mentioned violence. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that. You
Okay.
mentioned a few minutes ago that people hold certain beliefs, and one of the variables that you study is the level of violence they're willing to engage
Mm-hmm.
in order to protect them. And then you mentioned that the more vulnerable people feel,
Mm-hmm.
on any number of dimensions, financial, social,
Mm-hmm.
even physical, perhaps, the more likely they are to have a visceral, virulent reaction to things.
Mm-hmm.
So, tell me a bit about your research or your understanding about the connection between um, exposure to different worldviews and the violence, and by which I'm assuming you mean like physical harm to another human
Yeah,
being
physical harm,
that
but
we perpetrate on each other.
absolutely physical, but also symbolic, like hate speech, bullying. It can be physical. It can be literally, you know, violent conflict, or
Okay,
it
so
can be,
let's explore the different levels and
yeah,
and the reactions that and why we do this to each other.
yeah. I mean, I think there's just, I don't know. I mean, I don't consider myself an absolute expert here, but I have thought a lot about it, and I have studied a lot of violent processes, right? Historically, like when violence tips towards mass violence, and like such as the cases such as the Holocaust or even mass rebellion. So this kind of tipping point, the way that discourse foments and crystallizes, then suddenly ordinary people act in ways that seem shocking to us, like, or they wouldn't under certain conditions. And I do think that this ability, like, to crystallize existential fear, to first of all, people like certainty, right? We know that we like certainty. We know that it's difficult, that we have to sometimes even just talking with people that bring a different perspective to us. And I don't even mean just like attack us. I mean just bring us a novel perspective that we've never thought of before. Or if people arrive in a package that we wouldn't have expected them to arrive in, like people like people to abide to the stereotypes we developed as more primitive animals, as shorthand for safety, for survival, right? And so we're walking around with this, lizard brain. I think a lot of pop neuroscience talks about the lizard brain, right? Which is the fear
Mhm.
response, the fight or flight. And so there is a neuropsychological dimension of all of this. But I think we can just stay in the philosophical to say that there's this need to know where we stand, right? And it's pretty.
And do you know why? Like, because I've noticed that too. I like what you're saying is that people, like, it's really hard just in social circumstances
Mhm.
to say I don't know, right? And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do with this
Mhm.
podcast and my work with CFIC is to make I don't know a socially acceptable
Yeah.
response.
Yeah.
But we turn to people and we kind of we demand answers, we demand certainty, we want
Hmm.
to lay it out for me. What is it? What I mean, philosophically speaking, that should be a perfectly fine response. I
Yeah.
do know the answer, and here it is. I think I know the answer, and I can speak with reasonable confidence that it's like this. Or I haven't looked at this. I don't know, and perhaps let's investigate that together. But that last one is you very rarely hear, and I mean, if you particularly from a public figure or a politician, they consider that poison. Why do we have such a? I'm going to assume it's a psychological need
Hmm.
for certainty, and why is it so hard to hold on to uncertainty and say it could be black, it could be white, it could be gray, and
Hmm.
and to leave it at that until more information becomes available.
Hmm. I think, I mean, the kind of short answer is that the work, like, on security of, like, personal, intellectual, psychological, just security that people
Mm-hmm.
have to be comfortable with that is pretty high. And there are all kinds of narratives, like people, they might experience existential despair in their roles as housewives, but yet housewife is a role that gives you a lot of known social stability, so people can respect, like, in certain circles, being a wife and a mother is a narrative that's known, recognized, and valued. So that you have to be a self beyond that perceived social role, that you have to be someone, or that you can also be someone that can hear, that that cannot feel threatened when someone criticizes stay-at-home moms, say, for example. So then suddenly your whole universe, like, people just have to do work to know that it is okay for other people to do other things, and yet there can still be value to the choices that they make, right? So it's actually really hard work, I think, for people. And we one of the things I try to work on with my students, it's really frustrating because there is this sense of, like, to critique neoliberal capitalism and exploitative capitalism, we have to also critique the myth of individuality, right? And yes, the Herculean individual that triumphs over everything and needs no one, that is a toxic myth. But that people also do have to somehow, like, and granted, they have to have the privilege, like, kind of, the basics have to be met. You have to have enough food. You have to have safety. You have to have healthcare, right? Like, this is, I think, why social policy matters. But the
Mm-hmm.
idea, right, that there can be a non kind of homo economicus, let's call it, in their parlance, self that thinks, that reflects, that works on feeling secure in the face of non-clear signals, right, about where you stand, in the face of difference. So in the face of feeling rejected, or challenged or threatened. Like, how much do we work on helping people cultivate that in education? Like, and we have defunded the humanities consistently in the West right when we needed them the most, which was as the information age is taking off. Because what the humanities allow you to do is read novels of people whose lives are very different from your own and think reflectively about the twists and turns of those lives. And I think that the mistake of pushing STEM without humanistic inquiry is terrible, right? Because that analytic capacity to be able to read a storyline, to see that people invest their lives with meaning under very different circumstances than your own, right? To cultivate just a sense of reading the world and to reflecting back on, like, what is it I want? What is it that I desire? What is it that I think, apart from the social validation system we've built to make people feel like they're on the right track, right? So it's really about this inner secret garden, kind of an Emersonian secret garden that doesn't dismiss social amelioration or social progress, but somehow also is invested in helping people cultivate an inner universe, right? That an inner universe that can be curious, tolerant, receptive to difference, right? Like, that is just, whew, it's like a tall order. I get tired even thinking about all the.
Okay. Well, all right. So I definitely want to explore that further. There's a lot
Yeah.
in what you just said. So I want to tie it back with something that we opened the conversation with,
Mhm.
and we spoke about whether people, like, are they are you going to place your trust or your faith in a
Mhm.
in a scientist or in a priest, because both talk about invisible things, right? The scientist talks about, and in one of your papers, you talked about invisible things like gravity, electricity, gases, and
Mhm.
organisms incapable of being seen with the naked eye.
Yeah.
And the priest talks about invisible things like the All Father, all
Mhm.
powerful deity in the sky who looks upon all of us, loves us, and judges us based on our actions. And after we die, there will be something different. The details differ from faith
Mhm.
to faith, of course. So both are talking about things that we can't see, firsthand. But the key difference is that um, with what the scientist is saying, you can't see directly electricity. You can't see directly gravity. But when we turn the lights on, when we flip a switch,
Mhm.
the light comes on pretty consistently.
Mhm.
When we throw a rock up, it comes down
Yeah.
every time. And we have things like airplanes and iPhones
Yeah.
and the internet and antibiotics uh, and so, in a sense, the scientist has earned the trust or the
Mhm.
faith that we place in them in a way that the evidence and proof is still pending from the claims of the priest.
Mhm.
So I want to tie that into what you just said about STEM, which is science, technology, is that engineering and mathematics?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Um, uh, Being emphasized and like, or rather being overemphasized. I'm assuming that you're not against STEM education,
Not at
but
all.
but
Very
to
much
the
the
but
opposite. Yeah. I
but,
started
but
out
to the
actually.
exclusion of the humanities. And
Yes.
so I would think, at least naively, that more STEM education would give people a better way to come to the conclusion that putting your trust in the scientist who has evidence and ramifications of their theories is better than, or going to be more accurate than putting your trust or faith in the priest who makes similarly grandiose claims but does not have the evidence or the ramifications to present to you.
Mhm.
That comes from, I would think, a STEM education would help with that. So why has the humanities been underemphasized, and what is the cost, or what are we losing
Mhm.
by de-emphasizing the humanities in our educational curricula?
Mm. Well, I mean, I think it does go back to this kind of, um, it's in some ways overstated and yet continues to be underestimated, like the deep need that humans have for story. like that we tell, you know, we tell the story of our lives. We tell stories of our exes, like,
I'll agree with you
and
wholeheartedly there. Yeah.
so if you give people science without story, they can turn on their lights, and yet they can't fill their refrigerator, and so they could even question the experts, right? That go along, right? Because this whole thing about like, how do I make sense of the coexistence of progress when then I also have to pay the electricity bill, and then I also might not feel like I can get a job that gives my kids a chance to have a better future than my own, because knowledge, it's impossible to depoliticize it, right? In the modern world, also it is inherently politicized. Even scientific laboratories are funded by someone, right? And so it's already going, science will already be connected to all the conflicts of interest that produce it, all the storylines that produce it, and all of our own paranoid, hurt feeling, hopeful human experiences. Um, and the humanities help you make sense of the stories of politicians, the stories of scientists, through the stories of writers and artists,
All right.
as a way to think more holistically about evidence, right? I do
So,
think,
all right. Tell me how make the case that
yeah.
if only we had more of a broad based liberal arts humanities component
Hmm.
in our educational system, not to the
Hmm.
exclusion of other topics, but more of that. How do we make better sense of the world? How do we keep our fridges full of healthy, nutritious food and
Yeah.
make sure that our bills are paid on time and successfully navigate the social world that we live in, not because we most people don't operate on the level of the laws of physics or the laws of chemistry. That's
Yeah.
much lower down in the levels of abstraction in which we live day to day.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure there's ever eradicating evil. Like, and I do, despite the fact that I don't have a religion of my own, I would say I'm more agnostic, but than a true atheist, just because how can I know, right? But despite that, I do think that there's evil and greed and destruction in the world, right? So that part, I don't know.
Well, it depends how you define evil. That
Yeah,
there is greed and destruction
yeah,
and malevolent actors in the
malevolent
world, I think,
actors.
is indisputable. And so, if you define
Exactly.
that as evil, then yes, evil exists.
Exactly. But that I think, like I was thinking a lot about, let's take the case of the rolling back of reproductive rights just to get real political real fast. But I think it
Okay,
is,
so we're in the United States.
I think so. In the United States, the reproduction of the rolling back of reproductive rights has to do with this kind of sense of existential, like, non-compromising binarism around these questions of body. Like, I think they were really whipped up during COVID, these existential fears around the body,
Mhm.
and the order that family, church, kitchen, mom, dad, like gender, all these primordial certainties, people fall back on them, I think, in times of uncertainty. That was a claim I made in my book, is that in moments of financial, informational, social and political uncertainty, primordialism takes root. So you might think of MAGA, paleo diets, and alpha males, right, or incels, kind of coming together in time against the tides of uncertainty as a way of rooting the world back to primordial stability. But I think the humanities implied, and maybe people precisely don't want that, and that's why we're having wars over syllabi, is like, I can understand that someone else has a different idea about the soul of than I do, about when
Mhm.
life begins, right? But one point in common that we have is about the nature of suffering, right? And so we need to be able to have a conversation about abortion that says the law, unless we want to live in a theocracy, and some people do, the law can't say something about souls. It cannot. It cannot protect souls, but it can protect around suffering. So then we have to have a very subtle and careful conversation about what reproductive rights, health, and policy has to say about forms of suffering. Suffering to a fetus, whether or not you consider it a person, suffering to
Mhm.
a woman and the whole circumstances of her life, suffering writ large, and how the law can best protect the rights of people to not suffer to the great, to a greatest extent possible, right? Within the bounds of certain kinds of legal frameworks, right? But that's really hard for people. It's hard for people that have had abortions and want to say absolutely no limits, like until birth, no limits, and other people that say absolutely abortion bans across the board because the soul enters the woman's
Right.
body, that right.
Human
So
life, starts at the moment of
yeah,
conception.
we cannot solve that, like that dispute, through legal means. We have to let the law, we have to be able to understand the law as a story that is mobilized, right, amidst complex dynamics to give the maximum rights and protection as possible and doing the least harm as possible, not in some kind of reductive utilitarian calculus, but really saying, what can the law say about a fetus? Like, and it can't say anything about a fetus until the moment that fetus is sentient, right? So until what we call viability, right? But people want, like, actually, some people want theocracy. That's what we see, right? They want to wrap the world in their belief system, and they want to make everyone submit to that belief system, so they never have to question. They never have to sit with a person that wakes up at 3 a.m. full of angst and despair. They want to chase that person away and return to these primordial certainties. And I think that is what literature gives us. Literature, reading James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, reading Hemingway, reading Shakespeare, like expanding the canon rather than trying to control it, so that we pursue as many forms of life and expressions of life and have to wrestle with as many differences as possible and make sense of those differences. So to really listen to the different epics of the different storytellers. Everyone has their tribal storyteller, right? But the humanities are here to give us non-tribal story listening skills, right? That we can listen to the bard from another tribe and try to understand, oh, how are they making sense? What's at stake for them in that way of telling the story, right? And if you listen to really religious extremism, what's at stake for them is that this world matches the afterlife somehow, right? That you bring the terms of the afterlife to the secular here and now, right? And that's theocracy. So knowing that some people want so much certainty that they want their religious doctrines to reign in secular space, but that means that there can be no toleration, right? And that also means helping people understand the risk that if you give over the story absolutely to an absolutist, eventually that absolutist might write the story in a way that escapes you, right? Like so I think
Yeah.
so it's
Well,
really,
that's the danger of authoritarianism or
yeah,
a dictatorship, right? Is that there's an expression that a member of the leopards eating faces party is
mm,
shocked that the leopards actually ate his, like, I'm shocked as a
yeah,
member of the leopard eating faces party that the leopard actually chose to eat my face.
yes, exactly,
uh,
and I think,
they will turn on you eventually.
yeah, exactly. And so the piece where democracy is always fragile is the piece where it requires this attunement to different kinds of storytelling, and to be able to think about, okay, what is the widest nature of justice? Does it really threaten, like, only if you're applying religious terms could it possibly threaten your marriage as a heterosexual, right?
Right.
That like, it's like this kind of thing, and that we,
That specific argument always mystified me. Like,
it's mystifying. How like,
how does same sex or equal marriage
yeah,
threaten my, like, I'm a straight guy, and so if another guy wants to marry another guy,
yeah,
how does that threaten my marriage? Or if a girl wants to marry another woman, I mean, unless it's some, like, bizarre thing, like if two women get married, it's reducing the available pool of women to me to get married. Like, I'm really stretching here, but like I really failed even at the time to understand
mm,
how allowing people to marry whom they want threatens the ability
yeah.
for heterosexuals to marry each other.
No,
I
and I
asked
don't
at the
think, I
time,
mean,
and I
there
never
isn't a good
really
answer,
received
except
a
that
good answer
people
to that.
don't want, like, I used to have these pig-headed conversations with people in church growing up about these kinds of questions, because it was also rural Nebraska, right? So you can imagine, like, there's a lot of really smart, open-minded people where I grew up, but there were a lot of really, like, as you might imagine, traditionalists of the most extreme kind that bound Christianity to a certain religious order of men working, women staying at home, strict heterosexuality, all these kinds of things that never made sense to me in a vast and diverse world. But I used to have these conversations, and I would say, okay, so you believe in heavenly justice, so let justice be for the afterlife. Like, let people meet. Why can't you just let go then and say, okay, if they're sinning, and if you aren't sinning by the codes of your own religion, you are keeping the precepts of your own religion, can't you just trust the divine to deal out the justice that you think those people deserve in the afterlife? Why do you need to be the carrier of a certain kind of your conception of religious justice, like to punish or to banish sinners? Why can't that be for the afterlife? Like, and they just
Hmm. Well, I mean, I'm the secular chair for CFIC. I am a
yeah.
strong proponent of both freedom of religion and freedom from it, and I spend a lot of my time and effort striving to make Canada, specifically the government promoting the idea and the policy that government should be neutral in matters of
Mm-hmm.
religion, neither supporting nor
That's
suppressing it.
nice. That's nice.
So you certainly have a receptive audience in me talking about the secular
Yeah.
the secular world and the importance of secular governance. Theocracy, or really
Mm-hmm.
any kind of totalitarian or authoritarian regime, is one that is
Yeah,
antithetical to what I
absolutely.
consider
And
to be a
precisely as you
moral
say,
or
for the
just
protection of religion as well.
society.
Like, that people should be allowed, under, to the extent that that they're not in
Yeah,
violation of the law, they should be able to practice even bigoted within their own communities.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, your faith may demand that you kill those that don't share your faith, but that's even under a freedom of religion
Exactly.
regime, that particular
Exactly.
action is going to be banned,
Yeah,
regardless of
exactly.
how central it
Exactly
is
this.
to your faith tradition. So, all right, I want to
Mm,
move on to just one last topic, and it's I think it's not unrelated to what we said. There's in our quest for truth, there's a lot of people
mm-hmm.
that believe palpably false things. So things like um,
Yeah.
the Earth is flat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or heliocentrism, sorry, geocentrism, that the sun revolves around the Earth. But I got the sense, you didn't state this explicitly, but I got the sense from reading some of your works that um,
Mm-hmm.
that fads work on a kind of similar principle. So that there are these the manias that exist, and I'll just bring up a couple examples
Yeah.
in business or the economy. Like, there was the dot-com boom, and like, if you remember, a quarter century ago, 1999, 2000, the greater your losses, the less
Mm-hmm.
profitable you were, the better it was for your stock
Yeah.
price. Like, there was just this idea that the internet changed everything, and that profits weren't necessary anymore, and people were spending like ludicrous sums on business models that were never going to turn a profit, and they
Yeah.
were being like rewarded for it on a scale that was almost unprecedented. And there's similar things You can see similar fads today. They're like blockchain blew up and then collapsed, and then 90% of them went down, and a couple are still there, but it's nowhere near
Yeah.
in the conversations that are happening in the business press today. Nowhere near the level that we saw 3-4 years ago. And anything that's happening on there is much less than the hyped claims.
Yeah.
Today we've got AI. We'll see what effect AI actually has in the world, but I don't see how it can have anywhere near the effect
No.
that is being hyped today. And um, there are
Yeah.
people that
Yeah.
fall for swindles or scams all the time too. And technology has a huge path, or sorry, a huge role to play in terms of duplicating or
Mm.
falsifying or creating counterfeit goods. Like there's an eternal battle, for example, or
Yeah.
arms race between counterfeiters and those that print currency. And so I got the sense that these three ideas
Hmm.
are kind of are connected in a fairly deep way, and I got that impression from your writing. So do you agree that these are
Yeah.
similar? And if so, can you
So,
connect them for us
so
and
one of the
sort
things
of
that I
paint
think
a
I teach a
full
class
picture
this
for
semester
us?
called Making Sense of Conspiracy Theory. And yeah, yeah. So,
Okay, great.
so
This is,
one
yeah,
of the things we
please,
try to
please.
do is like we
That's
start with
make it
paper
make sense,
trails
please.
and we end up with QAnon, right? And at every turn, I give them a lot of primary sources to analyze. They have to do a lot of writing, a lot of reading. I give them a lot of time to read, even though I expect them to read a lot, because it's complex to make sense of conspiracy theories rather than just saying these people were crazy, these are the consequences of being crazy. Like, you have to accept the rationality of wild belief. Yeah, exactly. And it will, and it has, and it does. And so I think the kind of convergence is this: first of all, that ideology, whether it be religious faith or doctrine, right, is also always about, like, look at the way that Galileo was persecuted, right? So scientific belief and faith, part of why new knowledge systems are challenging is that knowledge holds the balance of power and the distribution of resources in place, right? There is a prevalent common ideology, a major kind of like a shared ideological ethos, and then there are minor fractured heterodox opinions, but there are usually reigning ideologies, right? Now, of course, the information age complicates that. So to the extent that we see kind of polarization, we also see subgroups and niche groups, and the proliferation of different forms of believing. um, but I think the thing we have to understand is how conspiracy theory is always about this moment of radical uncertainty and what to do with it. So finding a scapegoat, or saying, if you think of the lag in flat earth theory, right? Like, you get the emergence of flat earth theory, you know, centuries after heliocentrism, right? Centuries after the circumnavigation of the globe, right? In a moment that's actually about the conquest of the earth,
Hmm.
right? So it kind of coincides with the Berlin Imperial Congress, where the European powers divide up Africa between themselves, right? And so I think I'm all about tying together, helping students understand that there's forms of economic, social, and political transformation at work, and then people will latch on to a conspiracy theory that kind of reduces and explains things that they either don't want to look at, or that they see but don't want to understand, or that in some way threatens to shift somehow the nature of their livelihood or their sense of belonging, right? And so, to me, every case you have to look at the kind of together, like social ferment, new scientific innovation, transformations in the socioeconomic structure, political transformations, and then enter the conspiracy theory and try to figure out, who are these people demographically, socioeconomically, where do they stand, what do they want, what do they think they're getting out of these belief systems, what structures do they use to defend them, right? Like, what arguments to these to defend them, and then you take them really seriously as a text. So we literally read pamphlets from flat earthers, past and present, right? So current flat earthers that emerged in a different, that flat earthers, current flat earthers, ironically, are kind of in the age of SpaceX, right? Whereas the first time around, it was like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, right? But train travel and steamer travel, right? So really thinking about
Right.
technology, its impact on economics, politics, all those things, and then trying to read the story that the conspiracy theorists are trying to tell, right, as a way of understanding why they're orbiting this particular set of beliefs. And so that is really hard work, right? It's really hard work. And I, sort of forbid my students from saying simplistic things like they were crazy or like they have to really try to understand what is the narrative being mobilized and what could be the reasons.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
an individual might be crazy, right?
100%. Yeah.
There are psychologically unbalanced or damaged people in our
Hmm.
midst. But when you're talking about a community, when you're talking about a society, like a society, there's something else going on
Yeah. Yeah.
when you get these pogroms or purges or
Hmm.
organized violence
Yeah.
against witches, or you mentioned the Holocaust, the organized,
Hmm.
structured,
Yeah.
systematic extermination of a majority of the world's Jews. There's something else
No,
going on
no,
that you can't just
you
say,
cannot. And then there's been a
well, they
lot of
were
work,
nuts.
specifically in genocide studies, not just Holocaust, but genocide studies more broadly, about the power of that, like reducing everything that's wrong with the world down to a single scapegoat, right? Like that one group could
Right.
be blamed for all the troubles in your life, or yeah,
If only we get
exactly.
rid of these troublemakers, we
And I
can
get why,
enter a
but I was
new
pretty disturbed with some of
utopian golden
my
age.
lefty friends, who I love, like around the MAGA populations, just the viciousness with which they could speak of Trump's supporters in the US as if they were all stupid, insane, ignorant, or just kind of blindly greedy and seeking destruction, right? And just how easy that is, right? Just how easy it is to just assume away the kind of the reasons why people come to a conclusion that you find so odious and so different, no matter what risk it poses. And I do sometimes think we have to act against forms of that kind of risk, but I think it doesn't make any sense to act without understanding ever, right? Like that understanding is essential. And I've seen a lot of stuff on
Right.
Twitter. I never had social media before, but people saying things like humility is for elitists. Um, we need to be able to just act. And I'm like, see, this is the result of the defunding of public education. That that radical patient understanding became an elite good, right? And it became, a threat, um, instead of a tool. Uh,
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, okay. You travel in different circles, but to
yeah,
me, I hear you say
yeah,
this, and it's like, if you don't understand what you're doing, like if you don't, if understanding doesn't precede action, how on earth are you going to have any confidence that
no,
your
exactly,
action
like
is going
exactly,
to achieve the desired result?
yeah,
Right? It's just thrashing about blindly, and I mean, maybe you get what you want, but that's like, I don't know, rolling a dice or buying a lottery ticket. Sometimes it works out for you, but it's not. If there's no understanding,
hmm,
you're not you're
yeah,
unlikely
no,
at
absolutely.
best
And I
to
think,
achieve the goal that you're seeking. And people are but people are calling for
yeah,
that and
in some
saying that
circles, like not
understanding
mine
before action
necessarily, but just like
is a
there's
bad
some
thing.
Twitter accounts I follow out of pure curiosity that pose themselves as left leaning, but that say things like that, right? And so I'm
Hmm.
trying to also understand right now the polarization politically. So yeah, to me, education intellectual inquiry, but it's specifically this harmony, this needed alliance between deep humanism, right? The humanities, literature, history,
Mhm.
philosophy, right? And the social sciences and the hard sciences, right? That there would be this reunification and then also a deep commitment somehow towards public education, right? And the importance of funding it is to me one of the only ways that we can guard against the kinds of conspirational thinking that leads to political violence, right? Or that leads people to put public health objectives at risk, or right, that we be able to really look at the details, look at the facts, weigh the risks and the potential of things, and then to engage in forms of trust with other knowledge producers, right? Yeah, as a way of cultivating this kind of toleration, yeah, that we need to be able to listen to the other. Yeah, that would be my hope. My hope as an educator, like I'm pretty dedicated to the nerdy quest, including of books that very few people read, because of the place it holds inside of the system of education, right? You need people to be able to engage in these even arcane subjects that have no immediate practical value, but they do have a long and enduring practical value, is that we're really teaching people how to think, how to engage critically with the world and with scientific knowledge, with texts of all kinds. Yeah, so that's how I consider. I said in another podcast recently that erudition is my activism. Right? That's what I try to bring to the classroom, especially, but then also, through my intellectual work.
Yeah, as a secular humanist myself, and
Mhm.
an advocate for strong codes of free expression, and in fact, on my laptop, I have a sticker that reads, "I don't I don't want to tell you what to think. I just want you to think."
Yeah, exactly.
There's
Amen.
a lot that you say that resonates deeply with me, and
Yeah,
I'm very glad to have met you. I feel like we are fellow travelers
absolutely.
in many respects. So, Carolyn Biltoft, any last comments or thoughts
No,
today?
just thank you for this opportunity to talk to folks, and just the wild and wide appeal that people keep reading history and literature, right, and philosophy, um, going to museums, getting library cards, all those all those things. That's it.
All right. Well, Carolyn Biltoft, thank you. This has been a
Thank you,
wonderful
Leslie.
conversation,
No,
and for
pleasure's mine.
appearing today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please show your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web and Facebook and Twitter at CFI Canada. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.